If it was the 1990s and you just couldn't get enough of Scream, well, then you were in luck because they made a lot of movies that were a lot like Scream. We're talking 90s self referential teen horror films, or Scream knockoffs, here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, must see, and downright notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But in short, what we do at the Horror Movie Syllabus is we take a particular subgenre of horror and we look at 3 examples of that subgenre. And today what we're looking at is something admittedly a little myopic. 90s self-referential teen horror films, or for short, Scream knockoffs. As I indicated in the cold open, Scream came out in the 1990s and basically saved horror. Horror was in a severe doldrums at the time, and Scream came along and reinvigorated the entire genre. I discuss this a bit more in a different video. I'll probably put some sort of little card or whatever for that. But it is very noteworthy that Scream was such a phenomenon, such an important seminal film in horror, that of course studios started replicating the formula, basically churning out movies that turned the horror genre on its head, movies where the characters were self-aware or where it was winking at the audience because it knew that the audience was familiar with all of the tropes and all of the horror staples and was kind of trying to subvert them or otherwise just kind of surprise the audience or let the audience in on the joke a little bit. Now, just because a bunch of these movies were being made and because overall it was kind of a derivative thing, which, is kind of Hollywood in a nutshell, it doesn't mean that these movies were bad. In fact, there were many that were extremely good. Again, like I said in the cold open, if you really like Scream, which I do, then you were probably pretty happy to see a lot of these movies come out. It's worth noting that this craze was a bit short-lived, but you started to see that horror really followed big waves of trends after this moment. And we'll talk about that more in other videos. We talked about it a little bit in the J-horror video, if you guys have seen that. Again, maybe I'll just put a little card to that up here. But the idea that the horror genre would kind of swing into different phases or different trends or different themes wound up being kind of what we see to this day, actually. And it all starts, in my opinion, with Scream and the 90s wave of Scream knockoffs. So in honor of that movement, we're going to talk about 3 of the best examples of Scream knockoffs. As usual, in the horror movie syllabus, we organize these films by level: undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. And in this case, we're just going to talk about them in chronological order because since they're all 90s films, it kind of seems to make sense to stick to a idea of chronology. So without any more delay, let's just go ahead and get right into the movies. The first movie that we're looking at in this video, the undergraduate selection, is I Know What You Did Last Summer. Now, I Know What You Did Last Summer is probably the most well-known and most high-profile version of the Scream knockoffs or the 90s self-referential horror films. And there's a reason for that. It's actually written by the same writer of Scream, and it comes out pretty soon after Scream comes out. This is interesting because Kevin Williamson, the guy who wrote both movies, he wrote it before Scream came out and couldn't get anybody to buy it. And then Scream was a massive hit, and he was the hottest writer in Hollywood. And at that point, I Know What You Did Last Summer sold like that. It was rushed into production, and it was released very quickly. It came out in 1997, I believe. And it's kind of the template for what a lot of these movies would become. It's a slickly produced movie with a self-awareness or an understanding of horror tropes and an intent to subvert them. A WB-worthy cast, a cast of young, hot actors. It really kind of just has a formula. It sets up a formula that would be repeated ad nauseum throughout the decade. Now, while the cast is a bunch of pretty people from the 90s, I have to admit that the cast is really good for Know What You Did Last Summer. It stars Jennifer Love Hewitt, who, interestingly enough, was in a show called Party of Five in the 90s, and her co-star in that show was Neve Campbell, who is the star of Scream. So you can already see the knockoff parallels happening. The movie also stars Sarah Michelle Gellar, who is an incredible actress, better known as Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I am a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Sarah Michelle Gellar. So she is welcome in every movie and makes every movie better. And so you're seeing my bias a little bit here, but she's great in the movie and probably should have been the star of the movie, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. Also stars Freddie Prinze Jr., who would go on to be a famous Jedi, if you like Star Wars. And also the underrated Ryan Phillippe. It's a great cast, and they do really good work here. So they're not just a bunch of pretty faces. Unfortunately, as the formula would get perpetuated later on, it became more about the pretty faces or the trendy hot actors from whatever show was popular at the time, and less about whether or not they were particularly good or good for the role. Like I said, the movie has really strong production values. It's a really well made film. The story seems fun. It's a good, fun story. It's a clever script the first time you watch it. If you think about it a little too much, you're gonna see the cracks in it. You're gonna be a little bit more eye rolly about it, maybe, or perhaps we live in an era where an audience, especially the younger audience, is a lot more savvy. You've seen a lot of these uh, kind of movies, a lot of these conventions being turned on their heads, seeing a lot of these twists happen. So it may not be as clever today as it was then, but I still think it holds up pretty well. I saw it fairly recently. I was surprised at how well I thought it did hold up. For a 90s movie, it didn't feel quite so 90s, and I thought that it was very enjoyable. Again, not the strongest, most amazing script in the world. It's not the most revolutionary film, but it is revolutionary in the sense that it basically became this blueprint for a bunch of knockoffs of this subgenre, of the Scream kind of self-referential subgenre. If you haven't seen I Know What You Did Last Summer, I definitely would recommend it. Um, it's a standard slasher film. The plot is a bunch of kids getting stalked by a slasher, but it's fun. It's a fun movie as long as you're not looking for anything too deep or too life changing. I think the movie is very satisfying. I think that it holds up well. I think the performances are great. I think it's a lot of fun. Check it out. Let me know what you think. The next movie we're looking at, our undergraduate level movie, is Urban Legend. Now, I really like Urban Legend. This movie kind of just, I don't know, it kind of hits a sweet spot for me a little bit. The movie is basically a movie about urban legends actually happening to people. So it takes these campfire stories that we're all familiar with, the killer hiding in the back seat, things like that, and just turns them into a movie. And it's a lot of fun. The movie is not taking itself too seriously. That's all maybe one of the themes of the movies in this subgenre, the self-referential 90s teen horror. They know better than to try to make something really classic or deep or anything like that. They're just out to have a good time, and this movie delivers that. Like I Know What You Did Last Summer and pretty much all the other movies, it has a notable 90s cast of recognizable in the 90s faces, names like Rebecca Gayheart and Josh Jackson. And they're good. They're good in the movie. Like I said, they're not really cast as much for their acting ability as for their notoriety. But in this case, that is appropriate because one of the things that I really like about Urban Legend is that it plays a little bit with the self awareness of the actors, or really the audience awareness of the actors. It knows that these actors are kind of known for other things, and it plays with that a little bit. It winks at the audience a little bit in that regard. And that's something I like about the movie quite a bit. I think that it's playing with the audience in a way that lets the audience feel involved or included in on the joke rather than kind of, mocking the audience or something like that. It's very effective. The scares work pretty well. It's not, again, the most intense or scariest movie you're ever going to see. It's well made, it's well produced. It's not anything auteur or anything mind blowing in terms of cinematography or camera angles or anything of the sort, but it's a solid movie. It's not cheap or poorly made. The acting is all, sufficient, if not good. The characters are likable. It's fun. I definitely think that you should check it out. I definitely think it's worth your time. I want to manage your expectations for you seeing it. I don't want you to think that it's going to be one of the greatest movies of all time, but it is one of the best 90s self-referential teen horror films of all time, which I don't know if that's saying much, but there it is. It's a personal favorite of mine. I really enjoy it. They did make two sequels to it that are pretty much forgettable. The first one's the one that's worth seeing. So if you haven't seen the first one, check it out. Let us know what you think. And the last movie we'll be examining today, our postgraduate level movie, is Cherry Falls. Now, admittedly, I'm cheating ever so slightly when it comes to Cherry Falls because it came out in 2000, but I saw it in 1999 because I had the pleasure of seeing it at one of those test screenings that sometimes you get to see, at least out here in Southern California. And it was, I think, maybe my first test screening as well. It was a lot of fun. And we got to see it in advance, and I loved the movie. I absolutely loved the movie. The premise of the movie is it's a slasher film, but the killer in the movie is killing virgins. So everybody in town starts trying to have sex and lose their virginity so that they won't be killed by the killer. It basically takes the trope of the virgin living last and the kids having sex getting murdered in the typical slasher film and inverts that. And that's a fun twist. That's a fun take on the movie that works really, really well and makes it a lot of fun, makes it really funny. I remember really enjoying this movie. I remember the entire audience, the entire test audience, really enjoying this movie. I thought it would be a huge hit when it came out because the audience I saw it with loved it, and I thought it was really well made, really fun. But it didn't really seem to make that much of an impact when it came out. I don't really know why. I don't know if it was just released at a bad time or if because we were getting into the 2000s and kind of moving away from the 90s self-referential teen horror and into things like J-horror and found footage movies, maybe that this movie just wasn't cool anymore. Maybe the trend, the fad had passed. But for whatever reason, it didn't really hit. And that's a shame. And it's never really found its audience since then either. It's never become quite a cult classic. And it should because it's really, really good. I really like this movie. The star of the movie is Brittany Murphy, who I had the pleasure of meeting at a party years and years ago, kind of before she got famous. It was post Clueless, but pre everything else she had really done. And she is, or was, a lovely person. She's really, really sweet, really considerate, really charming, and gone too soon. But as a result, ever since then, I've always been a big fan of hers, and I tend to really like movies that she's in. I really tend to like her in those movies. And she is what carries this movie. She is a big piece of why this movie works. She's very talented and she's very likable in the movie, and she kind of holds the movie together so that it never really spins out into ludicrousness or silliness. I mean, the movie is kind of silly. Don't get me wrong. It's just as much funny as it is scary, and the scares are not particularly noteworthy. It's just a fun ride. It's something that is enjoyable to watch. It's something that you don't have to think about too hard, and it's playing with those conventions just like the 90s self-referential teen horror movies do, but it's a good time. I'm bummed out that it's not a bigger hit. I'm bummed out that people don't know more about it. Maybe people watching this movie will check it out and it'll get a little bit more love. I hope so because it's definitely worth your time. It's definitely worth getting a little bit more of a cult favorite or a cult classic reputation. I'd like to see this movie get a little bit more notoriety. If you haven't checked it out, please do. I definitely vouch for this one. And if you do like it, let me know what you thought of it. If you don't like it, let me know why. We'll have a conversation about that. I'm always trying to foster conversations in these videos. If you have a differing opinion, I'm open to that. I want to have discussions and I want to hear what you have to think about it too. So those are our picks for the three best 90s self-referential teen horror movies, or the three best Scream knockoff films. If you like these kind of movies, like I do, we'd like to give a few extra credit suggestions out so that you can check out a few additional movies. The first one I'm going to mention is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I mentioned earlier how much I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the show. Now we're recommending the movie. But be forewarned, if you are familiar with the show and you like the show, the movie isn't quite the same. They were both created by Joss Whedon, who we have talked about and we will talk about. But the movie was not completely his creative vision, and you'll be able to tell when you see it. That said, it still can't be fun. It's maybe too campy. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, gets a really perfect blend of horror and comedy. Buffy the Vampire Slayer really leans heavily into the comedy, but it's fun. Christy Swanson plays Buffy, and the late Luke Perry plays her love interest, and they're fun in the movie. It's worth watching. Paul Rubens steals the show as a vampire, and it's fun. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's enjoyable. It's kind of a not just a cult favorite, but kind of just like a cultural touching stone. Like, you should have seen Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It's just one of those movies that you kind of should have seen. So if you haven't checked it out, check it out. The next movie I'll mention is The Faculty, which is a 90s teen horror movie set in high school, of course, and it's become something of a cult favorite amongst millennials. I'm not a huge fan of this movie. I like it. It's fine. It's not one of my favorites. It's a fine way to pass the time. It's definitely worth a watch. That's why I'm adding it here as an extra credit film. But millennials, I think it is, maybe younger than millennials, maybe it's or older Gen Z people, really seem to like this movie. They really seem to have a special place in their hearts for it. And it seems like that's a nostalgia thing. It seems like maybe they saw these movies, or this movie in particular, when they were younger, and it's kind of stuck with them, which I get because I feel that way about movies that I saw when I was younger, only I'm a little bit older than those kids. So this movie I saw when I was in my 20s, and so it didn't have the same effect on me as it would have as on a younger person. So if you're one of those people who remembers it nostalgically, fondly, great. I don't hate this movie. I don't have anything bad to say about this movie at all. It's an enjoyable movie, and I would definitely say check it out. It's just, it doesn't mean as much to me as it probably does to those people. And the last movie I'll mention for extra credit here is Disturbing Behavior. Now, Disturbing Behavior is another 90s teen horror movie set in high school. This one stars Katie Holmes, who I'm a big fan of. I really like Katie Holmes. Kind of like Brittany Murphy, I would say she's one of those people that is always a welcome addition to a movie. That said, I don't always like the movies that she's in, nor do I always like her in the movie. So that's worth noting. But I do think that she's really good in this one. I probably like this one a little bit better than The Faculty. I think they're very similar, both in terms of tone and in terms of look. They really do kind of encapsulate that 90s look, that 90s aesthetic for the 90s self-referential teen horror films. That phrase is very hard to say, by the way. But I definitely think that this one is probably the better of the two, and I would probably push this button a little bit more than the Faculty button. That said, they're both good. They're both worth checking out. If you like these kind of movies, check them out if you haven't seen them. And if you have seen them, let us know what you thought of them. So that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you very much for your attendance. If you think that some movies should have made this list that didn't make the list, there's a good chance that they're popping up in other subgenres on the horror movie syllabus. But either way, leave a comment down below and let us know what films you think might have been missing from this video. With that, we'll call it a day. Class dismissed.